welcome to another episode of the Good Roads podcast. In the co-host chair with me is Good Roads' Andrew Blackburn. And today we're joined by Dr. Wes Marshall, a professor of civil engineering and urban planning at the University of Colorado, Denver. He's authored over 80 peer-reviewed publications and is widely recognized for his research on road design, urban planning, and the hidden flaws in our transportation systems. His latest book, Killed by a Traffic Engineer, takes a critical look at how outdated and unscientific traffic engineering practices have shaped our roads, often at the expense of safety. He'll be one of the keynote speakers at our upcoming conference in a few months. Wes, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. So Wes, we mentioned your book, Killed by a Traffic Engineer. I think a lot of people have been talking about it. So why don't we start with that? Why don't you tell us a bit about the book and kind of why you decided to write it?
The book is my attempt to sort of just go down all the different rabbit holes to understand the science or lack thereof behind traffic engineering. And, why I decided to write it was partially, a lot of my research is based on things that annoy me or make me angry. And this was one of them. Like whenever we were, designing stuff, because before I went back to academia, I was in consulting, and the stuff we were putting out in the world was never as good as the stuff I knew from where I grew up in and around Boston. And I was like, well, why? And I'm the kind of person that would ask why. Like, why are we doing it this way? And, you start going down a little bit some of those rabbit holes. You start seeing there isn't really as much science as I was taught as a traffic engineer, as I was led to believe, as all the manuals that are tossed on our desk when we're young engineers is like a half dozen thousand page manuals. And you assume that whoever wrote these did their homework and they knew more than you do. And then you start digging in. It's like, well, no, they had fully admitted they didn't know. So, part of this was me trying to quench my thirst for understanding, not just what we do was wrong, but sort of why we do it that way and why we think this is right. So that is a little bit of what went into that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and that's really interesting because you would assume in this day and age, like a professional of X or Y or whatever, just there's thought and process and real kind of scientific evidence to go into the profession. Like if you go to a doctor, you kind of assume that the doctor is not just doing something because they've always done it that way, but because it was based in some sort of study or and obviously it evolves over time, but that's just kind of an assumption that you would have, and it's like, okay, shouldn't that apply to the people who are doing our public infrastructure, who are building these roads or bridges, and who are supposed to keep us safe? But at the end of the day, a lot of times that is not. I guess it is reflective of that because that's not really what's happening.
Yeah, I start off the book talking about doctors. Doctors have been around for 5,000 years. For the first 1,000 of those years, you could pretty easily argue that they killed more people than they saved. Over time, they've gotten better. It's an empirical science. They learn. They keep getting better and better and better. And what I'm saying is traffic engineering is only 100 years old at best. Like we're still in our infancy, and we're still in the stage where we might be killing more people than we save. Problem is we don't know it. Like we think that we have all the science behind all the stuff that we're doing that's in our manuals that we're being taught to do. I thought it was the case too. Like, oh, hey, if we do this, it'll be safer. But guess what? Like, we never tested the safety, or if we did, it was, on some flawed study from like the 1930s or 40s or 50s. And we stopped sort of citing those studies or even looking at them and just thinking, like, the theory keeps persisting over time, and we, in order to get out of this, we sort of have to realize that what went into where we're at now isn't all that scientific yet. So we can get better. So part of the hurdle is realizing that we even need to.
Huh. And I'm sure this has gone over well with the traffic engineering profession.
That's been actually one of the most shocking parts of it. Is it's been pretty well received. Like I've spoken at the Institute of Transportation Engineer International Conference or like the Western Region Conference. I just did a couple of presentations at the Transportation Research Board Conference, and most engineers that I speak to were hungry for this. Like they felt it, they knew it, but not all of them have the time. When you're a consultant or you work for a city, like you're so busy, you don't have time to dig down these rabbit holes like I did as an academic that gets annoyed by stuff like this. So they were thankful. Of course, there are a couple engineers that hate the title of the book, and even though like in the book I'm saying it's not your fault, like this is what you're being taught, this is what you're being told,
Yeah.
but a lot of them that feel that way are refusing to read it. So
Mhm.
to me, it's like, oh my God, they're proving my point. They're sticking their head in the sand.
Right.
Like, this is great. So it's nice to have a small contingent of engineers that, and I joke that they're sticking their head in the sidewalk. They're not
Yeah.
even giving the book a
Well,
chance.
yeah, I
But the
like it.
fact that most of them are happy about it is heartening to me. Like I thought it would be more pushback from that side, but
Yeah.
it's been good.
I think the title is pretty important. I think it's pretty essential. Like, if you want to shake things up, you got to be able to piss off the people that are, liable to push
And
back.
I'm one of them too. So to me, it's sort of self-reflective. I'm not out there saying you. It's like no, it's me, it's we. It's like we need to do better. But here's the information I wish I had when I was a young engineer. Because when you're in that, I don't know about how the education process is for engineers in Canada, but for me, I took one transportation engineering class, just one,
Hmm.
and I got my professional engineering license in transportation. So you don't know any better to use engineering judgment and overrule these guidelines. You just have to do what they tell you, assuming that the science is steeped into it. I talked to other engineers. Some of them took zero courses. Like the way our accreditation works, you don't actually have to offer any transportation engineering courses. And they've worked a whole career as professional transportation engineers without ever having taken a single course. So
Mhm.
there's a disconnect there, and you can't do anything but follow the manual. So I'm trying to give what I would have wanted as a young engineer to people that are out there. So a lot of them are happy to it, see that. Some of them again get annoyed with the title, but that's okay. Like you're right. I think stirring things up is
Yeah.
it's not a bad idea.
Do you find any difference between like the younger engineers and the old guard, the ones who have been in the industry? Like, are the old guard more resistant?
Yeah, if you generalize it, the young engineers are definitely thirstier for it. But there are plenty of older engineers that have come up to me, and they have sort of known this throughout their careers and
Mm.
are trying to do better work, but they've been met with the resistance that is our discipline. So there are enough of them that it makes me happy to see that. I mean, but I've also talked to people that were so frustrated they even left the field of
Mhm.
transportation engineering because they couldn't make the changes they wanted to make, and now they're doing something else, and they see my book and read it. They're like, oh yes, like this is why I left, like this is what I was up against. But I mean, what I try to tell them is like, oh, I wish you were back here. Like these are the people we need in this discipline that are trying to make it better, as opposed to just the business as usual.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it is tough at times to kind of uh, uh, make change in an industry when there is so many kind of, I don't want to say vested interest, but when there's it's almost like you're going up against a wall and you have to kind of chip away and chip away and chip away at it. And that comes up. That's with anything when it comes to trying to make change. Or Andrew and I work in advocacy and kind of government relations. We're always kind of trying to make change, and a lot of it is just banging your head against a wall. And then it could take years before you see some sort of a change. And within an industry that's and it's like with professional engineering, it's a regulated industry. It is tough to kind of make that change. So it's good, I guess, to hear that some of the younger folks are interested in it, and they see it and they want to, because young people, they want to have they want to feel like they're making a difference and that there's value in what they're doing. And sometimes being able to make that change within an industry, it gives them that value and that satisfaction.
Yeah, I mean, I think of a lot of, I mean, even my research before the book, a lot of it is giving people the ammunition they need to do better work.
Right.
I know the arguments you get, whether it's in a public meeting or from the more conventional engineers. So a lot of that I know isn't based in truth or fact. So if I show, provide the research and do the research to help fight those battles, and um, a lot of the students, even though I'm in the engineering department, a lot of my students I work with are urban planners. Like for the engineers, I'm trying to kind of enlighten them to show them that yes, you've taken all these courses with us, but everything in there isn't quite so that it doesn't really lead to the kind of places we want. For the urban planners, I'm trying to teach them to more effectively argue with an engineer. Like engineers are really good at shutting down conversations with jargon, with certain words. Like you guys probably know this. Like you see, oh, we can't do this. It's a warrant. But if I
Yeah.
teach my urban planning students what that actually means, like where they do have leeway and where they don't, like what kind of science is that warrant actually based on, then I can put them in a position where they can be more effective.
Hmm.
Sounds like Thomas and I should probably take your courses actually to communicate a little better with our engineering colleagues.
So Wes, you argue that much of the traffic engineering is based on some of these flawed assumptions rather than science. What do you think is the biggest like myth that needs to be debunked?
There's so many. Like one of the simplest ones is just the idea that wider roads are safer.
Yeah.
Like I was taught that, like we want to give people a factor of safety. Like that's the thinking we have, and part of that is because transportation engineering is embedded within civil engineering, right? In civil engineering, it's there's structural and hydrology, and if you're building a building or a bridge, like what do we do? Like we figure out the design load and we multiply it by three, and we figure out how big the beam needs to be, and we can make it even bigger. Bigger is safer. Might cost us a little bit more, but that's okay. Same with a culvert. If you're designing a culvert, you figure out the 100-year flood. You can make it even bigger. It's okay. Mother Nature doesn't get windier, doesn't get rainier, depending on the size of my beam, right? But with transportation, it's trickier, right? When you put a bigger road in front of a human being, they don't quite behave the same way. So when you look at the empirical results, like the wider roads are actually less safe. But when you look at the studies that led us to even think that, there's like three studies in the 1930s, and they looked at roads that were 18, 20, 22, and 24 feet wide. So the widest road they looked at was 24 feet curb to curb. And yes, in that study, 24 feet was safer than 18. Like, does that extrapolate to mean the 60s better than 24 or 80 or 100 or 120? But for whatever reason, like we cited those studies for like 10, 20 years. And then like in the 1950s, 60s, like just the idea perpetuated through time, the idea that wider roads are safer. And we stopped citing those studies. Like, so if we look back, it's like, well, what do those studies actually tell us? Well, 18 and 24, like there's some science there, but they knew full well it didn't extend beyond that, but we treated it like we did. And the idea, the theory has perpetuated, but we haven't backed it up with empirical results. So that was talking about before. Getting back to being more of an empirical science will help us get better. But part of it is kind of looking at where this science even came from. And it's the studies like that that get, to me, it's like, oh my God, really? That's why we do this?
Yeah, it's funny. I think that's probably one of the number one things. So Andrew and I are non-engineers, but that we kind of hear constantly is like, yeah, wider roads are safer, and the other one is adding another lane of traffic will solve congestion. And I feel like even as like people who don't have a background in the actual engineering side of things, we're just like, no, this is wrong. Like it needs to be debunked. Or actually maybe it already has been, but
yeah, it has.
This is why we try to get speakers like you to come and talk to people in our industry.
I heard David Zipper on your podcast talking about induced demand, or was that Jeff Speck? One of them. They were explaining.
Might have been both.
Yeah,
might have been both. But to me, in that case, we're not even asking the right questions. Like the goal of transportation is not reducing congestion, right? The goal is to get people to their work, to school, to social opportunities, whatever it is. Like if we ask that question, how do we help people do that? One of the tools in our toolbox is reducing congestion, but now the toolbox is way bigger. If the goal is reducing congestion, it leads us straight into the road widening thing, and that's proven time and time again not to work. It usually makes things worse. So to me, it's like that's a case that we need to ask the right questions from the get-go and start doing things to help that cause, as opposed to just thinking congestion is the real problem. Because if your city solves congestion, your city probably sucks. Like nobody's there. Like that. That's how you solve congestion. Make a city that nobody wants to go to.
Well, I would have suggested congestion pricing, but I guess that's another that's another way
That's
to
the
do it.
only thing that's proven to work is congestion pricing.
Right.
So water, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, I mean, that's what's interesting about transportation to me is that a lot of it is counterintuitive. Like you think adding a lane will help the cause, but not so. Like you think giving people a factor of safety will help the cause, but when you start adding humans to the mix, which like isn't the case when you're designing a beam, that's what makes transportation to me exciting. That you get these counterintuitive results. So that's why we need to be more empirical than theory based.
Hmm. He, yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Andrew. You're going to say
No.
something? Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say I think one more point I'll make on this kind of thing about empirical and evidence versus and myths and whatnot versus science is in Ontario, and you may have heard about this all the way down in Denver, but there's been debate about bike lanes and ripping out bike lanes. Um, and apparently that's going to solve congestion. And I think that is also rooted in myth that if you put a bike lane in, it does not increase congestion. Um, it gives another option for people to kind of move from point A to point B. In a mode of transportation that does not take up as much space. But that's another thing that we've been wrestling with in Ontario.
Yeah, no, I have heard about that, and you're right. I mean, it's not gonna. I mean, they might feel like it. Like people that are drivers might feel like they're waiting longer at a particular traffic light, but when you look at the overall data, like they're still getting across that corridor, oftentimes like faster than the speed limit or something like that. I mean, so this actually reminds me of some research I did that I don't even really talk about that much in the book, but this is probably 15 years ago. I was doing some research, just looking at trends in safety, and like we know, like a conventional driving city is like so safe, let's say, and we know transit is safer than driving. So you would think a city with a lot of transit would be safer than a conventional driving city. And yes, that's true. At the same time, like biking, we think is more dangerous than driving. So you would think a city with a ton of bicycling would be more dangerous than a conventional driving city. But we found the opposite trend. Like those cities with a lot of people bicycling were not just safer than the driving cities, they were our safest cities. They were safer than like the transit cities. So later we did some research as to why, like what is happening here. Is it safety in numbers? Like, is it the infrastructure different? Is it maybe there's different types of people that are in this city versus other cities. And one of the biggest differences we found was the infrastructure. So the cities that were putting in more protected and separated bikeways, they weren't just safer for the bicyclists, they were safer for everybody. And that was like the biggest difference. Like people in their cars were safer
Huh.
because whether, maybe those bike lanes are acting like traffic calming, like maybe whatever it is, like there's a lot of things you can hypothesize as to why. But I mean, that's the benefit of bike lanes that we don't really even talk about. Like they're actually making it safer for the pedestrians, for the drivers, for the people that are taking the bus, people that are taking the train, whatever it is, like it's safer for everybody. And those are the kind of cities we want. And, ripping out a bike lane, it feels, I mean, we're just heading in the wrong direction with that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not. Our reputation's kind of taking a hit with all of this stories globally. A lot of people are citing us as going backwards, and it's kind of
You're
harsh
not
to
the only
deal with.
one doing it. I was talking to some people from Houston. They're ripping out these road diets they had done.
Mm,
And they're been proven to make the streets safer, but it's more of a political thing. I mean, that
Yeah.
is part of the problem when it comes to talking about safety. Is it devolves into discussions about other stuff. It's political, or like you're talking about camera enforcement. You're talking about like Big Brother's watching it, so it's a cash grab. Like if we can keep the conversation on safety, like what does the data actually tell us, we'd be much better off.
Um, so when you were writing the book, let's go back to the book. When you were
Yeah, yeah.
writing the book, what was the most surprising or unsettling kind of thing or discovery that you made? What shocked you the most?
So I you kind of imagine that there's going to be these like evil people doing evil things, like dastardly whiplash, like telling us what to do from some of these things that we ended up focusing on. But it was rarely that. I mean, a lot of times the engineers were saying, hey, here's what we know now. Like something like level of service, it came about in the 50s. It sort of haphazardly was thrown together. And they said in the initial edition of the Highway Capacity Manual, we need to add safety to this measurement in the next iteration. When the next iteration came, they just removed that sentence and we never added safety to it. And we just kept going. However, there were a couple times when there was sort of a character behind it. The one of them, one of the things that really always annoyed me is how we just measure safety. Like we measure safety in terms of like a crash rate, which we want a crash rate because we want to have some take into account exposure. But when we measure like fatalities per VMT, vehicle miles traveled or kilometers traveled, and in the U.S. we do it per like 100 million vehicle miles traveled. So when you think about that, there's two ways to get a safer place. One is we reduce the fatalities. The other is that we drive more. And it's like, this doesn't make a ton of sense. Like we're building our places based on this mentality that more driving means more safety. When you think about it logically, like that's not how any humans would treat any health impact. Like we don't, like we treat it more on a per population basis, and every other health impact is measured that way. And when I found the story of why we do it, it was the former CEO of Studebaker, the car company. He
Huh.
was not happy in the 1930s that cars are being made to look unsafe, and he made the right point that we need an exposure metric, but he just picked the one he liked best.
Mm.
And he wrote a book, book from 1939 I have behind me, Seven Roads to Safety, and he barnstormed the country selling this idea to this burgeoning new discipline. And even more recently, I found out he was sort of behind our jaywalking laws in
Huh.
the 1920s. They're the same guy, Paul Hoffman, and he was the I guess the biggest before he became CEO of Studebaker. He was their best salesman for selling cars. So it's a good salesman, and he sold us this idea. This is how we should measure safety. And in the 1960s, the U.S. codified it with our U.S. DOT, or the precursor to that at the time. So now we continue to do this nationally, even though it doesn't make a ton of sense. Like if I die on my way to work and I only, bike a mile, like for some reason that's way less safe than if I die 5 times and I go 10 miles, right? Like the numbers don't add up when you
Mhm.
start thinking about it as like, where do you want to live as a human? Where do you want your kids to grow up? But it all comes back to that sort of one guy and he did a great job. If you look at the graphs of how safe driving is per VMT, it looks like we are so safe. But when you
Right.
look at it per population, we're like last in the world. Like you guys are doing much better than we are in that. But yeah,
That's well, that's a little bit of a curse. As Thomas and
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time looking at statistics, traffic statistics in Ontario, and it's kind of a curse being compared to the United States. It's like, well, at least we're always better than the United States. It's like, well, we can
all
obviously
relative,
be a
right?
lot better. Yeah, well, and that's another funny thing. Is like I think you said in your book that there's historic underreporting of traffic accidents or deaths or something like that.
I mean, there's just we all want a more data driven approach
Yeah.
to road safety. But that part of it is like the data needs to be good for us to do that. So there's different issues with the data. Like one I always talk about is the human error idea, like the idea that human error is the biggest problem. But when it comes to like bike and pedestrian crashes, there's huge underreporting on those things. Like we know that full well. Like there's
Yeah.
some great studies that try to link the hospital data, and there's so many of those crashes that end up in the hospital data that don't end up in my crash database. Or the fact that at least in a lot of cities in the U.S., there's like $1,000 minimum property damage that needs to occur for even us to take for the police officer to take down the details and for that crash to get into
Ah.
our database. So when I was in high school, I bought a car, I think for $800. So if that car was totaled and nobody was hurt, that would not get into a crash database. But if two Teslas bump each other and there's like $5,000 worth of damage, that gets into a crash database. So you
Ah.
start
Huh.
seeing some income disparities. Like you're going to get more crashes in wealthier neighborhoods than lower income neighborhoods.
That's really
Part of it
interesting.
too is that, with good reason, at least in my country, a lot of people don't want to talk to the police if they don't have to, so they won't even report the crash if
Yeah.
it doesn't isn't something that leads to it. So if we want a more data driven approach, great, but we need to be able to trust the data, and there's some problems there.
That's really interesting, and it kind of makes sense to me, just from staring at a lot of this data, where it's like the data that you're getting from the healthcare system doesn't seem to align with the data that we're getting from the province or even from the police. And the police is talking about, we made this many arrests for this many speeders. It was like, well, that's because you were out there actually trying to find. It's a little bit different than the,
Yeah,
the
yeah. No,
statistics that we're
we get
getting
that
from the
with sort of
government.
the enforcement where they're trying to use data to figure out where they need to do enforcement, but the data comes from where they previously had done enforcement. So if you're enforcing in a lower income minority neighborhood and you're getting a lot of data saying you have a problem with speeding there, you send more cops to continue that, perpetuate that thing. And so there's cycles of this that, and part of it too is the built environment we put in front of them. Like if we have a design speed with a factor of safety that makes people, we're designing for sort of like the worst of the worst driver almost. And, the road's designed for 70 and we tell people to go 30. Like we know full well they're going to go more than 30. So is it really an error if they're doing that? Yes, we're trying to enforce it, but we could do it another way. We do a more self-enforcing road where we set the design speed more like a target speed as opposed to that factor of safety. And then you don't even need the enforcement. So there's other ways to think about these issues that we typically don't do it that way.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Another question we wanted to kind of pick your brain about, or to kind of ask you about, is and I think it was mentioned in the book, is how engineers often blame human error for crashes rather than poor road design. Um, how like what are some kind of real world examples where better design could prevent fatalities?
I mean, it's useful for the police or for insurance companies to blame the bad actors in the system. Like, I don't want to get rid of that. But for the engineers and the planners, it's not helping us. It's sort of taking away our feedback loop. Like, if you look at any crash, like example I was giving yesterday was a jaywalking crash in um, Vancouver, Washington. So not Vancouver, Canada. It was sort of right below the border there. Two kids were walking to school. They crossed the street where they technically shouldn't. They got hit by a speeding driver and they died, right? High school kids, I think 14 and 17 years old. And it's easy to kind of zoom out and say, well, that driver should have been speeding. We could blame them, right? So what do we do in that case? Well, we educate people like, hey, don't speed. Like safety is everyone's responsibility, blah, blah, blah. But you take a look at the road, again, it's designed for like 70 and we're telling people to go 30. So of course he's speeding. And then you look at these kids in their situation we put them in. Like you see where they live and their schools across this street. The nearest crosswalk was like a half mile away. And they could either go north or south to get to the nearest crosswalk. They were sort of in the middle. You go to that crosswalk, it's not that safe of a crosswalk. You look at the sidewalks between where they were and where that crosswalk is, and they were missing. Like there wasn't infrastructure. So these kids did a very rational thing. Like given what we provided them as engineers and planners, like they did what most people would do in the situation, and then we blame them for it, and we never take a step back. Like so, the way that data gets into a crash database, we either blame it on the driver for speeding or these kids for jaywalking, and we don't think we have another problem, right? So if we treat every crash like, well, yes, it is a human error crash, but what could we have done differently in terms of the built environment? It gives us a whole nother set of way to think about things, a whole feedback loop that we can do better in terms of, hey, if we gave them better sidewalks, if we, maybe put a crossing where they were. Like there's so much we could have done to make the situation better, but we don't because the way the data gets to us, we don't think we even have an engineering problem. We just think it's either enforcement or education. And that's where we put our efforts. And we've been doing that for 100 years and it hasn't worked.
So how do we improve it to make it work?
Think about the data differently. Like treat every crash. Like ask ourselves why were these kids doing what they're doing? Like
Right.
put ourselves in their shoes. Like
Yeah.
especially for fatalities and severe injuries. Like we can't spend the time doing this for every fender bender, but for those serious crashes, like think about why these kids they didn't think they were making an error. They were doing what made sense to them. Like same with that driver. Like he if he knew he was going to kill somebody, he wouldn't have done that, but he didn't. He was doing what everybody in the road's probably doing. So is it
Right.
really an error if everybody's doing it? No, that's just typical normal behavior. There's so many crashes like that. Another good example is when you're taking like a left turn on a arterial, right? Sometimes you have that green arrow, so it's a protected left, but usually it's a permissive left. So you have the green ball. What are you doing in that situation? You're looking at the oncoming traffic for a gap in it. So you might have two or three lanes of cars coming at you. You're waiting for a gap in that traffic so you can shoot across to take the left turn. At the same time, you might have a car behind you kind of giving you back pressure. But while this is all happening, we tell the pedestrian it's their turn to cross on the side street. We give them the little white walk guy and say, hey, you're safe to cross here. And so we've sufficiently distracted that driver from looking at the pedestrian. And we know there's data saying that a lot of the drivers don't scan where the pedestrians are before they make that turn. And we've also hidden where the pedestrian is, that A pillar of your car is in the way. Like so, to me, we've put all
Hmm.
these people in a bad situation. But when the data gets back to me as a road safety researcher, it says that this driver didn't yield the right of way to this pedestrian. We need to educate them better. We need to tell the pedestrian to make eye contact with the driver. And that's kind of BS. Like, we
Yeah.
can do better. We put them in a bad situation. This is a systemic crash that happens all the time. We know why it happens, but our data tells us it's an education problem.
Huh. And have you seen like anywhere? Have you seen any jurisdictions like in North America? What you described from the U.S. That sounds exactly how it is in Canada. Have you seen anywhere other places or heard of any other places where they're doing it? Maybe not even right, but better than when we're doing it here in North America when it comes to that sort of stuff.
Well, I know you guys did. You guys take those road safety auditing courses a couple of years
Yeah,
ago, right?
yeah,
I
Yeah,
mean,
we were in the first class.
yeah, no, that's a good start, right? So that
yeah,
is you're looking at the infrastructure, you're looking where the risk is,
yeah,
but it's only a good start. Like you're basically putting a band-aid on a single thing, so it feels like you're almost playing whack-a-mole. Like you're not getting the systemic problems over your whole system. You're doing it at one intersection or one corridor or whatever it is, which is great. And you're starting thinking beyond the enforcement education side of things. You're looking at the infrastructure, what we can do with engineering. But at the same time, like the fundamentals that went into those unsafe places, we're not fixing. Like we need to look at things more systematically to get at those underlying issues. So that's a good start, and more cities should do that. And it's a proactive one. Like Denver, like one of the good things we're doing here is we have when a fatal crash happens, we have a team that goes out there that does kind of a post road safety audit type thing.
Hmm.
I think most cities are scared to do that because they think they're kind of admitting liability of
mm,
fixing something after someone dies. So the fact they're going out there and trying to make things safer is great. New York's been doing that for like 20 years, and it's not been a liability issue. So more cities need to do that. But again, that is more on the reactive side. So I prefer the proactive one, um, but the reactive side is better than nothing. Like if a kid gets hit in front of a school, go out there and make it safer. Like we can do that. And like those road safety auditing courses you guys took, you saw how we can. Like, and it's obvious when you're at some of these intersections or something. You look around, it's like, well, of course, this isn't safe. Like I took my
yeah,
safety class on a tour where somebody died with that road safety team, and like you're standing there, it's like, yeah, this is not safe. This feels in downtown Denver. It feels terrible as a pedestrian. You see like clear issues, like we have this huge electrical transformer right that hides where the pedestrian would be standing, even though cars were telling cars to turn into this person. It's like you don't see that kind of stuff in a CAD drawing on a computer screen. You actually have to get out there, and that's what you guys are
right,
doing in the road safety audits. You're trying it as a bicyclist, you're trying it as a pedestrian,
right.
and you understand it so differently.
Yeah, and I know that when in our something we learned in our road safety auditing course, funny enough, was that if you perform a road safety audit at the design stage of a road versus like after it's already built, I think it's a 36-to-1 savings in terms of lives saved, costs to society, that sort of thing, versus 6-to-1 if you do it after it's already built. So yeah, doing it at those early stages makes such a big difference because it's being built into the design in a way.
Yeah, and some of the things are tough to understand. I mean, because people don't behave exactly like we think they do in our micro simulation models, right? Like from a traffic engineering standpoint, our thinking is essentially our system is safe. If you all just follow the rules, you'd be safe. But then you go out to any place in the world and nobody is doing that, right?
Right.
But when you start thinking about why, like how can we design it to kind of get the behaviors we want and make it safer for how people actually use these real places as opposed to how we think they use, like sometimes you can only do that after the fact because you don't really quite know. Like I used to do a lot of site engineering work, and we would do like campus plans and stuff. And to me, it's always sort of a failure when you see like those paths through the dirt where kids are walking, right?
Yeah,
Or
the
somebody
desire
has
lines,
been
right?
through where kids are coming and going from. So instead of just putting a fence up there, like we should add a sidewalk where that is.
Right.
Similar things can be thought of an intersection. I was in Bogota, and they had all a hotspot of pedestrian fatalities. And when you look at where people like here's where people live, here's where the BRT is, like you see what they're trying to do, and they try to build this multi-million-dollar pedestrian overpass that the people aren't using. But it makes perfect sense while they're not using it when you look at the whole situation. So we can design for what people want to do and make it safer that way.
Yeah, and it's the same principle for those kids who are crossing the street in Vancouver. It's like that was the
Yeah,
most sensible
here's
way to
where
get
kids
across the
live.
street.
Here's where the school is. Like, fix that.
Yeah,
And to me, focusing on kids is often a good way to talk. I mean, it's hard for people to argue against making our streets safer for kids, right? So if we can make it safer for kids, it ends up usually making it safer for everybody.
yeah.
So
Well,
that's often a good starting place.
yeah, no, exactly, and that's right now in Ontario. We've just started doing speed cameras for the last couple of years, but right now it's really just focused on school zones. It's good. You got to be in a community. You have to, in order to install one, you have to frame it with kids in mind, either a school zone or a community safety zone. And right now, you can't really put these cameras outside of these zones, even though the people who are speeding are on much higher speed limit roads and stuff like that. So it's like we're, you know, we can argue for it if kids are in danger, but if we're actually looking at the fatalities where the accidents are happening, it's still a little bit more of a challenge. Those are the cost fatalities that aren't the kids.
Yeah, and that's the difference between being proactive and reactive. Like, I'm
Mhm.
not willing to wait around for kids to get hurt and die before I go in and fix the safety around their streets. Like, we know where parents are letting their kids walk or not walk. And if it's near a school and parents aren't allowing their kids to walk or bike, like we can make that safer. And there are things we can do more proactively, and we rarely do so. Like we're much more reactive discipline. We wait
Yeah,
for
definitely. Well,
someone to
even
die.
even yeah,
Yeah.
even with the audits right now, it's just like sure we're trying to institute this culture of the road audits, but right now in Canada we're pretty much only doing them reactively, where we have these accidents where we
And
know
the
there's
way our warrants, if you look at some of those warrants, like, one or two people isn't enough to get hurt. We need like four or five. And if they get hurt over like 6 years instead of two or three, it doesn't even meet our warrant. So like it's like, oh yeah, this kid got hurt. Oh, we need to wait for another one to get hurt before we do something. It's like, whoa, wait a second, that's crazy. But that's the way our system is set up currently.
yeah, well, and that's also like there's a political reason for that. It's like yeah, if things if it's getting to a politician's office, usually it means there's like 3 or 4 fatalities before that happens, and that's the only time you actually get some attention, and that's where the money comes from usually.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and okay, and it's interesting because you hear about that, but there's with the various different levels of government. Sometimes when something happens on a road, people will go to their city councilor or their mayor because it's a very kind of localized thing, and then we know things are complex. I know it's similar in the U.S. too, where some roads are belong to the state, or over here the province, or we even have regional governments and lower tier, upper tier, and it's this kind of hodgepodge of I don't want to say accountability dodging, but there's oftentimes, oh well, I can't do this because
Yeah.
I can't because of this or because of that um, or whatnot. But I guess the question I really want to ask you is for those in government, in local government, that want to kind of make a step to make their roads safer, to kind of prioritize road safety. What's something practical that they can do, that they can do themselves and not have to rely on a different order of government for?
Well, I mean, context matters so much. I mean, when I was a consultant in the New England area, and we're working in these small New England towns that, I mean, they look like they could be in a Norman Rockwell painting, but a state road comes right through the main street, right? So when I think about the more rural parts of Ontario, like for me, it's from like Sudbury and Shoresy and Letterkenny, like towns that I know from those shows that I enjoy. Like there's still like a main street where like the bar or that kind of stuff, like that context is still, even though we would not consider that whole area urban, like that's still an urban context right in and around that main street. So we can't have like a state highway blowing through there. So we would work in these small New England towns, and the state DOT is like, oh, we can't do on-street parking because that's a state road. It's like, well, you can, like, you're just choosing not to. Like,
Right.
when you look at what this area actually needs, it is a different context. So for me, streets like that need to change character as they go through different places. Like, you don't just blow the same cross section through the entirety of it. Like when you get like to Letterkenny, that big road can turn into a smaller road that has on-street parking and bike lanes and sidewalks and that sort of stuff. And then when it leaves it, it can turn into something different. Like maybe you put roundabouts at either end to tell people they're entering a different place. There are ways to do this well. Um, so I don't know. To me, like that, a politician or somebody in that sort of role, like don't take no for an answer. Like when you want a safer place and you're like state DOT in our case, or your province, whatever it is up there, is telling you, oh, we can't do this for a lot of that isn't true. And that's sort of what I'm showing in the book too, is like those arguments they're making aren't often based in science. It's just a decision we're making
Right.
to focus on capacity instead of safety. Not even capacity today, capacity 20 years into the future
Yeah.
capacity. And like we're prioritizing that over the safety of the people that live and work in that sort of smaller town.
Yeah, and a lot of the times for us, our provincial level of government, the way they build the roads, kind of going bringing this back to your book, they have certain standards and processes that they have to follow, and they don't design the roads that are supposed to have some of these things. For example, that you mentioned, on-street parking or roundabouts, or whatever. So they kind of look and they're like, "Oh, so sorry, yeah, we like it's not that we can't do that," and they're very risk averse as well because again, we go back to the whole liability issue. It's like, okay, I don't want to be the one to make that change because if something happens, then it's going to come down to me, and I'm the one who made that change or proposed that change. So it kind of goes back to the whole culture about trying to make change and trying to, especially in a public sector environment where risk and change isn't necessarily rewarded, and usually it's the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, and that is, I mean, this goes back to the idea of how little we actually educate our transportation engineers. Like, unless you get your master's or something, like I said, you're only taking one or two courses, maybe, or even zero. So you want to follow those books. But all those books we use, at least in the US, like engineering judgment overrules, it supersedes so almost anything that's in there. So when they say they can't do that, that's usually just not true. You can use engineering judgment to supersede like the warrants we were talking about. If you want to put a crosswalk near a school, you can use engineering judgment to do that. And even in the MUTCD, you don't even have to document what your engineering judgment says. So, like, to me, liability, I have a whole section in the book on liability. Like, we should start worrying about just following these so-called standards that are unsafe. Like, to me, that should be more of a liability issue. In New York is an example where a kid got hurt on a street that, even though they followed all the standards, they knew the street had high speeding, was unsafe, and New York lost the lawsuit because they followed the standards, because they didn't add traffic calming and that sort of stuff, because they knew they had these problems. So if we can switch liability around, this came up 20 plus years ago when traffic calming was a new thing. A lot of engineers were scared of the liability. Look at the research back then; it didn't come to fruition. There are ways to overrule that. I talk in the book about the rational process. It's almost like a tactical urbanism experiment. So if you can establish a problem with data, so let's say the problem is speeding, and you come up with your list of alternatives of what you could do to try to fix the problem, you pick one, you do it, you do some data after to see if you fix the problem. Even if what you did is not in any of those guidebooks, you have protected yourself from liability because you're solving a problem through engineering and you documented the whole thing. Like that protects people from liability. But like you said, a lot of people don't even know you can do that. They just think they have to follow these guidelines, and that's just not true. Engineering judgment and using that sort of process can protect you from liability and still make safer places.
Right on. Andrew, is there anything you wanted to throw in there before I move on?
No, we can move on.
Okay. I guess one of the questions I kind of wanted to kind of round out this discussion on is kind of what message do you hope that the readers of your book, the people attending our conference in a couple of months, whether they're traffic engineers or policymakers, politicians, or even just everyday kind of people who are interested in this sort of stuff, what message do you hope that they take away from the book that you wrote, and also just everything that's been around the book, the hype around it? What are you hoping that people take away from this?
I don't know. I mean, the book's like 400 pages, so there's a lot of stuff. Even when I do talks on it, I don't cover everything. I don't come close to it. So to me, one of the things that's been really interesting is that people are taking away really different stuff than other people. Like someone reads it like, oh, this is what they focus on. Somebody else reads it, they ignore that first thing and they're focused on something different. So I don't know. There's so much in it, and I think I kind of naively I wrote the book. I thought it would go out there and I'd go back to my regular job and never have to talk about it. But it's a good problem to have that people
Yeah.
care about these things and they want to see better places and they are interested in it. Like I don't know, there was a time when back when I was writing it, I literally had 1,000 pages of notes on my desk here, like, and I thought I was losing my mind. I was like, oh my god, like what am I going to do with this? Am I crazy? And then I read one of Robert Caro's books about how his process was, and I felt way less crazy after seeing that.
Huh.
I don't know. I think it's just I don't know. It's heartening that when you put your heart and soul into something, like I tried to do with the book, people respond to it. Like they get it, and to me, I don't blame the traffic engineers, even though despite the title of the book, because this is what they were taught. So I want them to kind of take away that big picture thing is like, if they keep perpetuating these pseudoscientific things on you and your town, then you should get mad at them. Like that's when they are crossing the line because now we should know better. And it's not just my book. There's a lot of better research out there now that we need to start looking at to try to get better. And we can do so. Like it's not like the things we're doing in transportation engineering are not set in stone. Like these are decisions we made at some point. And oftentimes these decisions were kind of haphazard. It's because, some guy named Carl spoke up in a meeting and everyone else in that group thinks like, yeah, sure, let's do what Carl said. A lot of our stuff came to be like in things like that. So once you sort of realize that, you can start pushing in a better direction.
Yeah, well, I think it's an important part of the culture change element of it, where it's just all like, yeah, you can change the practices and you can change the you can add new research, but the culture sticks to it. I think even we were talking earlier about the narrower roads things. Sure, we were relying on this ancient research justifying wider roads, and now we have this new research saying narrower roads are better, but people are still attached to these old principles, and it's part of the culture that hasn't changed yet, especially in these. Thomas and I work with the local governments, and Thomas said, working with public servants, they're risk averse. They don't want to be the ones responsible, and it's kind of like it's good to have books like this that are affecting like the younger generations who want to make the change, who are in positions where they can actually implement them, but they just need somebody to back them up. So that's part of what this book
Oh,
does. It backs them
you're
up.
totally right about the culture. Like in my class the other night, we were talking about the history of like jaywalking and how that came to be. And first, they tried to do it with laws, but nobody cared. People kept walking everywhere. Then they tried to do it with education. Like they had Boy Scouts handing out little cards telling people what jaywalking is. That didn't work. Like what they had to do was change the culture.
Hmm.
Like in order to take the streets from pedestrians and give them over to cars, like they started having parades where they dressed jaywalkers up like clowns and they were bumping them with Model Ts. Like it became something where they would make fun of jaywalkers. Like so when you think about what are the lessons from that, and that's all from Peter Norton's great book Fighting Traffic. But what do we do today? Like how do we take back the streets and make them safer? We got to attack the culture of it. Like it's not simply just changing our policies and our rules, but the culture of traffic engineering is what we need to get better at.
Yeah, and that's why we have you come and speak at our conference to
Looking forward to it.
speak to those people on the ground directly, and you know, plant the seed in their head that yeah, change needs to happen.
Yeah, and that's what we try to do with our events. We try to bring in interesting people who kind of challenge the thoughts and the precedent, I guess, of people what they have in their head from they previously learned, whether it was through school or previous experience or something that they've just were taught from someone else um, in the industry. So, but with that, I think it's a good time to wrap it up. For those of you listening, if you're interested in what you heard, you can hear more of it by registering for our conference. Wes will be the keynote, the day two keynote of our event. And if you haven't read the book yet, he will be available to. There will be books, copies being sold, and he will be happy to sign it as well. There'll be a book signing after he presents. So be sure to grab your ticket and register for the event. Wes, thank you very much for your time. It was a great discussion. Keep up the good work, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of months' time.
Yeah, I'll see you soon. Looking forward to it.